Hey there, and welcome back to the Beginner's Garden Podcast. If you are wondering what you can still plant in July, you are not alone. This is the time of year where a lot of gardeners either slow down or we get overwhelmed. But the truth is, there is still plenty you can plant even in the heat of summer. In today's episode, I will walk you through exactly what you can plant in July, depending on where you garden, and I will share a few tips to help you make your mid-season planting thrive. And before we dive in, I want to personally invite you to my next live Zoom Q&A session happening on July 9th at 12 p.m. Central. If you're a Dream to Garden student, you are already invited, so make sure to check your inbox for those details. But if you're not a student, you can still join us for only $15. This is your chance to ask me specific gardening questions live, or if you can't make it, send in a question ahead of time and I'll be sure to answer it during the call. And yes, you will get a replay as well. Head to journeywithjill.net/shop to grab your spot. Now, let's talk about what to plant in July. A lot of what we talk about when it comes to what to plant when is heavily dependent on where you're located. But the good news is that most of us can plant all of these crops in July. If there are some exceptions, I'll be sure to note this, but this will apply to most of us. What we can still plant, believe it or not, are warm season vegetables. They will thrive in the heat and they can be planted in most of the U.S., especially zones 6 and up. The reason why you can still plant these is because most of them are quick growers. And most of us still have plenty of time before our first frost to be able to plant, grow, and harvest these crops. My number one recommendation, especially if you have an area that you've harvested something else from and you don't know what to plant, is to plant bush beans. Bush beans are fast growing, they're ideal for succession planting, and while the seed packet says they will mature in 50 to 60 days, I have had them mature in as little as 45 days, especially when they're growing in the heat of the summer. The seeds germinate quicker, the plants grow faster, and many times they can give you a harvest quicker in the summer than they would have if you had planted them earlier in the year. Another reason why I love bush beans this time of year is because when you're planting bush beans, you can expect the harvest to all come on at once. So if you're doing any kind of canning or freezing or preserving of any sort, bush beans are ideal for this. My favorite variety of bush bean to plant is jade. I plant that in my green stalks. I plant it in my raised beds. I've planted it in ground beds. I really like how fast they grow, how productive they are, and they have a wonderful product. I don't have to worry about them getting strings in them, which is a constant battle with some of my pole beans, but I really like these the best. Other options that a lot of gardeners like are Provider and Contender. My number 2 choice for planting in July would be zucchini or summer squash. These, like bush beans, are great for a second round because they are quick growers. 45 to 55 days generally is what you can expect from seed planting to beginning to harvest. Because these seeds are going to be planted in the warm soil, just like bush beans, you can expect them to sprout rapidly. Especially if you keep that soil moist, you might be looking at sprouting in just a few days. This makes it easy to get a quick crop here. Now, I would recommend that you plant these in an area that you didn't already have zucchini or summer squash, especially if you had issues with squash bugs in the past. And I would recommend that as soon as you plant the seed even, or at the very least whenever it sprouts, I would recommend covering them with insect netting. This will prevent the squash vine borer moth from laying her egg if squash vine borers are a problem in your region, and it will allow you to get a longer harvest. Now, you will need to take off the insect netting whenever you first start seeing female flowers. You can go ahead and keep them on if all you see is male flowers. They usually come on first to try to attract the bees around. So there is reason to want to take them off when the male flowers arrive so that the bees can start getting an eye on where they need to come for pollen. But especially when those female flowers start to come up, you definitely want to have the insect netting off unless you are going to hand pollinate, which I find who has time to do that in July and August. But this is a great crop to plant. And oftentimes when I plant zucchini and summer squash, either in July or August, I'm able to get an extended harvest at the end of the year because the pests aren't as big of a problem At least the squash pests aren't. Other pests are worse, but the squash pests are not as much of a problem at the end of the year. Now, all this is climate dependent, so definitely observe in your garden. My number 3 option for planting in July would be cucumbers. Cucumbers, again, will grow quickly. They will sprout in warm, moist soil, and many of them have options to choose that are quick maturing, like 50 to 65 days. Some very popular options would be Marketmore. This is a great option if you're wanting slicing cucumbers, or Boston pickling, which is a great option if you want to grow a big harvest of pickling cucumbers to make pickles from. In my experience, both of these tended to be a little bit more susceptible to powdery mildew, although I have read that Marketmore can be a little bit more resistant. But the thing you want to keep in mind, especially as we head into the fall, is that in many places, my area included, powdery mildew is a bigger struggle in the fall garden than it is in the spring garden. That's why I like to plant varieties of cucumbers and squash and zucchini for that matter that are more likely to be resistant to powdery mildew. Or if you have downy mildew, that would be the same thing. I found that Ashley is a good resistant variety. I grew that last year. And another one is Diva. If a specific cucumber variety is resistant or has shown some resistance to powdery mildew, it'll say it on the seed packet. But this is something I would keep in mind if you can, if you know that you deal with this disease. It'll just save you so much pain and heartache. I personally got sick of trying to find what spray works for this. When I was just able to start planting cucumbers that were more resistant to it, I didn't have to worry about spraying different things in the middle of the summer. Again, who has time for that in the middle of the summer? I want to get by with as little as possible. The next few options will be dependent on where you're located, but for many of you, you can still plant these. Okra, if you're in an area where you get hot in the summer, okra is heat-loving and productive, and especially if you stay hot through August and even the early part of September, you could still plant okra. They are a quick maturing crop, 55 to 65 days, and some popular varieties would be Clemson Spineless. That is probably the staple okra. I haven't grown it in a few years because I found other ones that I like better. But also you might choose a dwarf variety. I'm growing one, I think it's called Cajun Jewel for the first time this year. That's a dwarf variety. I'm also growing a type of okra called Jade. Again, the same as the bush bean, but it's supposed to be a little bit shorter. And the main reason I'm doing that is so that I can reach to harvest, because sometimes okra can get really large. But also, if you choose a dwarf variety, it's probably going to start harvesting quicker, which will be good for you in the later part of the season. Another crop you can still plant would be southern peas, like black-eyed peas or cowpeas. These are drought tolerant, more so than other of your summer vegetables. And these are great for your soil. Any kind of cowpeas, many people grow cowpeas as just a cover crop. I grow them when I grow them to be able to harvest them because we like our black-eyed peas in the South. But it would also be a great crop if you just want a good drought-tolerant cover crop as well. They are going to be about 60 to 90 days to maturity. That's quite a large range, but the reason for that range is that 60 days would be when you could harvest them more or less for the softer beans that you would go ahead and either freeze or you would can right away. But 90 days is if you want to save them to dry, to be able to store dry. That's really the difference between the days to maturity there. A good staple, the one that I like, is California Black Eye, and that's a really good one. Another one that people love that they grow, and I've grown it before. I really liked it, but my family didn't care for the taste, would be zipper peas. I think they're called zipper cream peas. Anyway, they're really good, and that would be a good option as well. But any kind of southern pea that's marketed as a cowpea would be a good option. Again, they grow quickly, and you're able to get a harvest in 60 to 90 days, and it helps the soil. Another option, and I love to plant this in July, would be corn. This is still possible early in the month. I usually will plant it around July 4th every year. And as long as you have between 70 and 90 frost-free days left, you should be able to get a planting of corn. If you have a smaller window of how many days you have until frost, you might choose a quicker maturing variety like Ambrosia. But the reason I like to plant corn in July, well, there's a couple of reasons, but one is because I like to be able to harvest corn in September. Now, I do like, my summer corn for sure, but I like having that later harvest kind of after the tomatoes have given their push. And usually I'm a little bit done with tomatoes by that point. And so then I'm able to harvest my corn. Another thing that I noticed is that corn is susceptible to strong winds. And we tend to, at least in my area, get more strong winds in June and in May. And so by waiting till July, we're able to, for the most part, avoid the strong winds that are going to knock them over. That hasn't always been the case, but it tends to be more of a trend. So corn is a great option if you have enough days. And finally, for the vegetables you can plant in July, you can still plant peppers and tomatoes as transplants. They're probably still being sold at your local garden center. Look for established starts at your garden center, your nursery, and you can expect them to start producing at about 60 to 75 days from transplant. Now, the thing to keep in mind is that if you are planting tomatoes, especially in the summer, keep them shaded for just a little bit until they acclimate, especially if you are in a really hot period in July. I've done this before, and they just don't like being planted out when it's super hot. Add a little bit of shade, make sure to irrigate enough until they get established. And one reason that planting tomatoes especially would be a great option now is that many of the diseases that you deal with early in the year, because it's really rainy, at least in my area, early blight, septoria leaf spot, they're not going to be as big of an issue in the later part of the year, because, at least depending on where you're located, because with us, we're drier as we go into August and September. And so it's that rainy period that exacerbates those diseases. So if you have had issues with those diseases in your early tomatoes, you might find that you actually do better with the later planting. Also, if you have tomatoes that have just burned up because it's really hot, if you live in the deep south, a lot of people in the southern parts of the U.S. actually prefer doing a later planting of tomatoes. They feel like they get a better harvest that way. So that's something to consider. With peppers, what I have noticed about peppers is that the closer that you get to your frost date, the more productive they become. And if you're planting them in the heat, they love the heat. And so they'll be able to be established quickly, and then you'll probably see that they produce faster. So if you haven't gotten peppers in the ground yet and you feel like maybe you're too late, this would still be a great time to plant peppers. Next, we're going to talk about what herbs and what flowers that you can plant in July. But first, I want to thank our sponsor, Organic REV. As we know, summer heat can be tough on our gardens. Our plants start to slow down, the soil dries out faster, and the stress on our plants start to show. This is especially the case in raised beds. That's why I keep using Organic REV even well after my plants have been established. Organic REV helps improve the soil moisture retention in the soil when temperatures climb, and it also boosts the microbial activity that keeps them growing strong even in the heat. I'll use it during a deep watering session or when a plant looks like it's struggling. And if I'm tucking in any late summer crops like we're talking about today, I will still dip that root ball into a 50-50 mixture of Organic REV and water before planting. It helps reduce the stress to that plant when we're transplanting it in the heat, and it gets the roots growing fast. If your garden is feeling the heat of this summer, Organic REV can make a big difference. Check it out yourself. Go to organicrev.com and use my promo code Jill10 to get 10% off of your order. Again, organicrev.com and use my promo code Jill10. All right, let's talk about herbs and flowers. The main herb that I would recommend that you plant if you need to, and you may not need to, is basil. Basil thrives in heat and it grows quickly from seed or transplant. Although this time of year, I think it'd be just really easy to throw some seeds in the ground because they'll grow really fast. You may need to do this, especially if you haven't been able to stay on top of pruning your spring planted basil and it's already gone to flower. And by that point, the quality of the leaves is definitely going to decline. So you may want to start out with a new plant. This would be a great idea to do in July. There are some flowers in the summer also that you can plant now, especially as a vegetable gardener. Not only do these attract pollinators, but they'll brighten up your garden through the rest of the season. Now, I want to hone in on the attracting pollinators part because this time of year, especially going into August, this is a time of year that I think it's called the summer dearth. I can't remember. It's been a while since I've heard this phrase, but basically there is a period in the middle of the summer when not a whole lot of natural weeds are blooming, especially for our bees to be able to get what they need. There's not the spring wildflowers, but then you don't have the fall flush of weeds like goldenrod and that kind of thing. So there's just kind of this time of year where they just don't have a whole lot to get. And if you're planting these summer crops, then you can support the bees, especially the ones that are native to your area. So not only are they beautiful, we all love flowers in our vegetable garden, not only could they attract insects that help keep the bad pests at bay, but they also help to support our pollinators when they need it during the middle of the season. The first one you're probably already growing because it seems like everybody talks about companion planting with this, and that is marigolds. Marigolds, they're beautiful, they're your quintessential summer flower, but they're also great for pest deterrents. And as I mentioned, they're beautiful. They're also pretty low growing, so you can tuck them in wherever you want. Zinnias are another option. They are heat tolerant, which is kind of hard to find in a flower sometimes. With them being so beautiful, you can buy them tall, you can buy them shorter, and they have long-lasting blooms. So they're going to stay with you probably, at least in my garden, until frost. You can also still plant sunflowers. I know we love to see sunflowers in July. That's when they start popping up all around fields nearby. But it's a great time to plant more sunflowers. Because the bad part about sunflowers is most of them, they're kind of a one-hit wonder. Now, there are some that are branching sunflowers and they continue to produce, but for the most part, they kind of fade out. And so if we keep planting sunflowers, then we'll be able to keep having that beauty in our garden. But not only are they beautiful, but they attract bees, they attract birds, and then you can harvest the seeds and find a YouTube tutorial on how to roast sunflower seeds. It's a really fun activity, something I did with my kids when they were young. Another sunflower type that you can grow is a little bit different, but it's called Mexican sunflower, also known as Tithonia. I love this plant, and I don't have to plant it anymore because it volunteers in my garden every year, but it is a pollinator and butterfly favorite. It's a branching sunflower, and like I said, I'm not sure if it's even in the sunflower family, but it's called the Mexican sunflower because it's similar, but the blooms are smaller. They're probably like maybe 4 inches wide, and they're this, at least the kind I get, are this brilliant orange, and they thrive in that fall garden where they attract all sorts of butterflies. Absolutely beautiful. And it thrives in full sun and it thrives in heat. So while some of your other flowers are going to start looking kind of sad in the heat, the Mexican sunflower is going to shine. Another option that you might want to plant is a nasturtium plant or nasturtiums. Now these, I'm going to have a little caveat. I have not found that nasturtiums love the heat. Usually by the time July comes around, my mature nasturtiums are looking really sad and I end up taking them out of my garden because they don't look good. But if you could get another round started now, they're going to love the later part of the summer, and then they will produce blooms that last till frost. And sometimes I've had my nasturtiums last through frost if they're established. Now, I think that when this happened, I didn't intentionally plant these. They had just self-seeded, or maybe a portion of them actually survived the heat. I can't remember, but I just remember them being beautiful as they headed into the fall. So if you have nasturtium seeds, this might be one to start from seed and then transplant, maybe when the heat calms down just a little bit, depending on where you're located, of course. All right, before we wrap up, I want to give you some additional tips for July planting. Number one, check your first frost date in the fall. I know it's hard to imagine this. We're in July right now. We barely got into summer, so it's kind of hard to think about our first frost. But what you want to do is you want to look and see how many days do you have before your first frost. If it's 70 to 80 days away or more, you have time for most of these summer crops. Another thing is July is a great opportunity for succession planting. This is something that I teach a lot about, especially my Dream to Garden students know how to do this. I teach you how to do this and plan for it. But if you haven't planned for successions, but you find yourself looking at bare garden space, or there's crops that are just like spent and like you don't want to take them out because they're kind of producing, but they kind of look ugly, I would say most of the consensus with me and people that I talk to, take them out, you'll feel better, plant something new, and you'll be able to get a second life out of that garden space. Another thing to consider is soil health. If you are succession planting, adding a new crop, consider topping that space off with new compost to reinvigorate that soil, to continue feeding those soil microbes, to continue adding nutrients for that second crop. And then finally, consider moisture and heat management. This is a time of year where it can get really hot and really dry. And so one thing that you can do that I recommend is to mulch heavily. Mulching will help keep the soil a little bit cooler, which will help with the roots and just the temperature of the soil altogether from getting too hot, but it also will help with water retention. Then when you water deeply, especially if you've got established plants like tomatoes and like peppers, water them deeply to encourage those roots to go down deep so they can be more resilient. On the other hand, when you're planting from seed, if you're planting squash or bush beans or something like that from seed, water those frequently but shallowly until they get established, because we want to keep that water nearby their roots. If they dry out, they could die pretty quickly, especially in this heat. So keep that in mind. And then if you plant out seedlings out in your garden, consider shade cloth. If you buy a tomato and you're planting the tomato in the heat of the day, which I wouldn't recommend, but let's say you're planting it during a hot spill, try to put some shade cloth on it until you see it adjusting, and then you can take the shade cloth off. But shade cloth is always going to be helpful when you're planting out young seedlings in the heat of the summer. Now, I know that July can be a really exhausting month, especially if you're starting to harvest like I am, and then you start to see the effects of the heat and age on your plants. But it's also a perfect time to hit the reset button and to keep your garden going strong. We still have so much of the season left. Don't give up. Don't just say we've had the best has already passed, which to some degree it has. I mean, we'll talk about the fall garden, but this isn't the time to stop. This isn't the time to give up. And I hope that this list gave you at least some fresh inspiration for what you can still plant now. Now, one more thing. July is also the time to start thinking about, and in some cases, planting some of your fall crops. And we will be talking all about that next week. So make sure to tune in when we talk about that. And before we go, don't forget, I'm hosting a live Q&A Zoom session on July 9th. This is a special opportunity to get your gardening questions answered by me directly in real time. You can join the call. You can ask me questions live, or if you can't make it live, you can submit the question ahead of time. I'll answer it on the call, and then I'll send you the replay so you can watch it and not miss a thing. Dream to Garden students, you will have already been invited. We're sending that Zoom link to your inbox. But if you're not in the Dream to Garden course yet, you can still attend for $15, and we would love to have you. You can go to journeywithjill.net/shop to join us. Thanks again. I hope that you've enjoyed this list of what you can still plant in July, and I'll chat with you again next week as we talk about preparing your fall garden. And in some cases, you need to get ready to start planting some crops really soon. I'll chat with you then.